There are three words being thrown around right now that would dramatically change the state of the war in Ukraine. No-fly zone. Ukraine's President Volodymr Zelenskyy has been passionately pleading with Ukraine's allies to close the skies and introduce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Around the world, there have been protests calling on members of NATO to support a no-fly zone, and some world leaders have even been called out directly.
Ukrainian women and Ukrainian children are in deep fear because of bombs and missiles which are going from the sky. And Ukrainian people are desperately asking for the West to protect our sky.
Despite all of this, the response so far has been a resounding no, and that has a lot to do with what a no-fly zone actually means. A no-fly zone is basically an order to prevent certain aircraft from flying through certain areas. You might see them in place over government buildings, sacred sites, or sporting events, and that can be for security, cultural, or religious reasons. In this case, the idea is that a no-fly zone over Ukraine, enforced by members of the NATO alliance, would help to stop aerial attacks which have been devastating parts of Ukraine. NATO members have been very vocal in their support of Ukraine, but so far, all of them have refused to enforce a no-fly zone. Enforcing a no-fly zone isn't just about telling particular aircraft not to enter a certain area. It means physically shooting down any aircraft that enters that isn't supposed to be there. A member of NATO shooting down a Russian plane would immediately escalate what is currently a conflict between two countries into a world war.
There's a great fear that if the dispute was to escalate and go beyond those current borders, that would immediately trigger potential NATO obligations under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty.
The way that NATO is supposed to work is that an attack on one is an attack on all. So even if just one member of NATO decides to help Ukraine, it could draw in every single member of the alliance if things escalate. That's something that NATO has repeatedly said it's trying to avoid.
The suffering we now see in Ukraine is horrific. It affects us all. And we have a responsibility to ensure the conflict does not escalate and spread beyond Ukraine.
There have been instances of NATO enforcing a no-fly zone before, for example in Libya about 10 years ago. But in that situation, the stakes were very different.
And there wasn't really much of a contest between NATO's air capacity and that of the Libyans, so it didn't pose as much of a threat.
Especially when the conflict involves a country with the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. To really drive the point home, Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that any foreign nation simply announcing a no-fly zone, let alone actually shooting down any Russian planes, would be viewed by Russia as an act of war. So, instead, many members of NATO have been actively trying to send aid and military supplies to Ukraine. However, President Zelenskyy has said this isn't good enough, and that NATO's inaction in this situation will lead to more Ukrainian deaths.
Ці люди, які загинуть від цього дня, загинуть також і через вас, через вашу слабкість, через вашу роз'єднаність.
The bottom line here is that direct military action is still seen as a huge risk that Ukraine's allies aren't willing to take. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure you subscribe to the channel and also check out the International Politics playlist on our homepage.